Hello everyone, this is Glenn from Homebrew U, and as promised, I am shooting video today of an actual brew day using my E-Herms system, and I am currently mashing. I'm brewing a 6-gallon batch of a Firestone Walker Double Jack clone recipe. It's going to come in about 9.1%. There's about 17 pounds of grain. This is just going to be a monster of a beer, and I can't be more excited. But anyways, back to what we're talking about here. So this is the panel in action, and I'm currently using my HLT PID. You can see it's set at 147, and so that's the wort temperature as it's passing across that probe back into the mash tun. And my target for the mash itself is 145, and I found with my particular setup to hold the mash at 145, I actually need to have that probe reading about 2 degrees over, and that just kind of keeps me straight in the mash tun where all the chemical processes are happening. So anyways, I do that, and then you can see also on that left PID that green light that comes on and off, that is the relay sending the signal to the heater element, and it's just, every time it thinks that temp might fall, it's going to go ahead and hit it again. As mentioned in my first video, I do have this voltage selector here. I'm currently switched to 120 volt, and you can see the lower number on that voltmeter, or volt/amp meter. Right now it's at 0, but every time that green light comes on, it's going to show some amperage, 10.7, 10.8. So that's the number of amps that are being utilized by that element with the 120 volt setting. When I'm set at 240 volts, typically it runs right around 21.6, 22 amps, something like that in my particular system. They all vary a little bit, but yeah, so this works really well just to kind of hold the temperature, whereas the 240 volt works nicely for ramping up temperatures. So, and again, that center unit there, that's my timer, and it's counting down right now. I'm doing a 60-minute mash at the 145 temperature, and I've got about 46 minutes left on it. And as soon as that counts down to 0, the alarm buzzer right above it is going to go off, and it's going to flash and also beep at me, let me know it's ready. And then you can see my element selector switch. I'm selecting the HLT. So what that means is there's no possible way that the boil element could accidentally fire while I'm utilizing the HLT element. So that's why it's really important when you set one of these up that you consider that, and you kind of want to make it as safe as you can, just so that no accidents occur, especially since you're dealing with liquid and electricity at the same time. It can get really scary if you're not careful. This blue light here, that just indicates that my pump number 1 is on, and basically I run the pump the entire time through the mash process. I have seen others kind of tie their pump to the PID. That way every time the PID fires, the pump circulates some wort. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that method. I'm not saying it's particularly terrible, but as we all know, these March pumps, there's priming issues, things like that. I think it's better just to let it run at a nice low clip, and I've had really great results doing it that way. So anyway, that's the panel itself, and coming down over here, this is the HLT, just an aluminum kettle, nothing fancy on this guy. Just going to open this up here. lid's a little tight. Anyway, there's the 1/2 inch stainless coil tubing being bathed in the water, and then that heat element down there, that's what's holding the temp for us. And then another thing, so talking about temperatures and everything in comparison to the mash temp. So as you saw here, I'm holding the PID about 147. That's the temp of the wort being read as it comes out of this upper outlet, going back into the mash tun in order to hold my mash temp at 145. Okay, so then the other aspect there is that in order to get that 147, my thermometer here in my HLT is, I don't know if you can read it real well or not, but it's reading about 148. So there's only about a 1 degree difference between the temperature of that water and the heat transfer that the wort is picking up as it's passing through, which I think is pretty good. I'm real happy with it. So anyway, just kind of based on that first video with the overview, I am using my larger mash tun today because, again, I am doing a very large beer. So basically I'm coming out of the mash into the March pump, coming back up, going into that bottom port, which is directly connected to the coil inside, comes through the coil, back out the top, and the temp probe right there on the back side of that T is reading the wort temp as it comes out, and then finally it comes up around and back into the mash tun. Just kind of open this here and show you. Mash is going, it's happy. And this one thing about the recirc is you get some really nice clear wort, and vorlothing and all that kind of stuff is becomes a thing of the past. So that's one huge benefit of the recirculation, besides the fact that you're able to keep that mash temp right on the money, and you don't have to worry about any natural cooling that occurs when you just put your mash in at 110. So anyways, that's that for now, and I'll get going again here in a minute once the next step comes along. Okay, so I'm still mashing, and one thing I wanted to show you is that you can see on my pump there, my valve controlling the outflow. You can see that pump is, it's not closed off obviously, but it's not open very much. The goal when you're recirculating, I think you want to be somewhere around 1 1/4 gallons per minute, something like that, as a flow rate. I haven't really actually measured mine, but what I do is I just kind of keep an eye on, I try to get a good balance between it running enough to keep the pump happy and get the wort all the way through the coil and back into the mash tun, but then also not to pull so hard that it's going to cause me any issues with compaction of the grain bed or anything like that. So that's just kind of one of those things as well, that maybe some personal preference. I mean, there is kind of a general goal out there, and I think I kind of tried to hit that when I kind of came up with this particular flow rate, based on my system. But anyway, just wanted to add that. So get going again here when I ramp up the temp for the next mash step. Alright, so I just switched back over to 240 volt, and now I'm ramping up the temp from the 147 setting up to 155, which actually I need to be more like 157 to hit my 2 degrees over. But now you can see for the 240 volt, the amp number there, 21.4, 21.5. It's kind of where it's going back and forth a little bit. So that just confirms to me that I am in fact, you know, getting the 240 volts now. Okay, so there's my alarm there, and I did not reset the alarm for the new temp, so now I'm going to take this up. Usually I set it for about a degree over my target temp. That way it'll let me know if you know, something's going crazy. And again, at the 240 volt mark, it's not going to take long at all for this thing to heat up to that next mash temp, which my target for the mash is going to be 155. And so I did 145 for 60 minutes, and then I'm ramping up to 155. I'm going to hold it at 155 for 10 minutes. And I believe that's a maybe a Firestone Walker thing. I don't know, but I think I read it in a book, and that's kind of what I'm going with. So hopefully this beer turns out nicely. This is my first time brewing this particular recipe. Pretty stoked about how it's going to turn out. But anyways, so yeah, right now I'm at 153, 154. My goal there is 157. So we're going to get there pretty quickly. And then once I hit that temperature, the 157, I'm going to immediately be switching that voltage back to 120, because it's going to end up overshooting it pretty easily if I don't. It's just kind of the nature. The PIDs send signals so quickly to those elements, which heat up like right now, that you know, having that lesser voltage option is just so helpful. It really is. So there I'm at 155. So while we're talking about temperatures, one thing to keep in mind with recirculation, whether you use an electric or not, is that, you know, when you initially put the grain into the mash tun, you know, with typical mashing, your strike temp is always quite a bit higher, you know, 11, 12 degrees higher than your target temp, and that's because your grain temp, you know, might be like 70 degrees. So once it hits your wort, or hits your strike water, it immediately starts cooling it on some level, and that's why we tend to overshoot it. Well, the same thing happens in these systems here. So one of the things that's kind of important to realize is that okay, hold on, I'm gonna go ahead and switch this over to 120. Okay, so now I'm getting more like 10.7 amps again. Anyways, one thing that's important to realize is that, you know, keep in mind that when the wort's coming out of that coil, you're going to get some instant gratification, but it's not necessarily accurate for the entire mash bed itself. So there is a little bit of a catch-up period. Okay, so keep that in mind, and that's why it's good to, you know, have some kind of temperature probe, thermometer, something that you can stick down in your mash and just kind of keep an eye on that mash temp. And I think for me, probably catches up in about 7 or 8 minutes, something like that, depending on the you know, obviously it depends how much grain you've got in there and how much water. So it's just something to keep in mind, that just because that probe reads your target temp right away, that's only because that wort is being instantly, you know, heated to that temperature as it's coming through the coil. But that may not, or it will not represent the temperature of the entire grain bed until it has, you know, basically cycled all of the wort in the grain bed at least once, maybe even a couple times to allow that temp to catch up. So anyways, just something to keep in mind. Alright, so I just got done with my sparge, and I didn't bother shooting footage of that because I'm sure everyone knows how to sparge, but basically I just wanted to point out a couple things. So the water that initially was in my HLT that was heating the wort and that the coil was bathed in, that became my sparge water. Okay, and one thing I like to do is I like to run it out of the HLT through the pump and then back into the coil, and then finally back out of the coil before it hits the mash tun. And the reason I like to do that is that it will give me a nice rinsing action of the coil, you know, for any residual sticky wort that might be in there. So that's one good thing. It's kind of a nice little pre-clean. And then the second thing is that you still got your probe here that you can take advantage of, and as long as some kind of fluid is passing across that probe, you can regulate that temperature and you can hold your sparge temp while you're sparging. Okay, so that's one of the reasons I like to do it that way. I mean, you don't have to do that. You can just come straight out of there into your pump, and then from your pump straight back into your mash tun. That's perfectly fine. Once you get up to your sparge temp, you know, you can just pop your lid on it and do what you'd normally do. But anyways, so one of the things I do want to point out about that, though, if you choose to go that route, is that you've got your element in there and it's firing, right, because it's maintaining your temperature. You need to make sure you watch that water level and never let that element run dry. So just however you want to do that, you know, just coming back and forth, checking on it. I've seen some people use float valves, things like that. You just want to make sure some way, somehow, that you don't let that element run dry. So that's really the biggest thing about, you know, the way that I do it. Okay, everyone, this is Glenn with Homebrew U again, and this is what 10 ounces of hops in the boil kettle look like in your fermenter. This is a 6.5 gallon glass carboy. So you can see that that mega layer of hops at the bottom. It's probably 4 inches thick, and that's not even including what was left behind in the kettle. Anyway, kind of fun.